Yo, I'm here with the first ever episode of this podcast of mine, and today I just want us to dig a bit into the objectives of slavery. So I'm addressing African history now, or one of the things that actually happened um, during African history or in African history. So first of all, it's significant to understand the elements that are used for execution and for engineering of slavery. They are actually two significant elements. That's the physical element and the mental element. Those two were used for the engineering and implementation of slavery. So when we actually talk about slavery, there were certain objectives that slave masters aimed to achieve during the process of slavery, of which we are going to cover them up now, go through them, each and every one of them, and see exactly what each entails and what we could learn from all these objectives that were the focus of slavery. You understand? So the first one, the very first objective of slavery that the slave master saw that it's significant in what they were doing is that they needed to eliminate the memory of the enslaved people. So why exactly would you want to eliminate the memory of the enslaved people? Because when you get rid of their memory, you are actually disconnecting them from their own true history, true identity, their own ethics, principles, traditions. You make them forget whom they are. What happens when somebody forgets whom they are? It means that there was a void that needs to be filled because they have no sense of identity. So if you enslave someone and you make sure that there is a disconnect between their own identity and themselves. It means that now they are subject to the possibility of adopting any identity that you give them. And that's exactly what happened when it comes to the enslaved people and the slave master, when he actually makes sure that he destroys the memory of the enslaved people. He then infiltrates his own version of identity that he wants the enslaved people to have into them. He makes sure that they become exactly what he wants them to be, because he made sure that they forget whom they are. Therefore, he's the one who now has the power to make them exactly whom he wants them to be. So that is the first objective of slavery. And then the second objective was to wipe out the sense of group identity. What exactly happens when you wipe out the sense of group identity? One of the easiest ways to gain control over a group of people is to implement something that's going to lead to divide. Anything that divides them into separate groups, anything that makes sure that they become enemies of each other. And that is something that the slave master made sure that he actually does, to ensure that there was division amongst the enslaved people. There's no group unity, because if there was group unity, there would be a possibility of revolting against the slave master. But because now there was divide, there is no that united power. There's no united front for the enslaved people to stand together and say, let us go against these people. Because one of the things about being united, it drives that unity strength. Like when you're by yourself and you have to face an enemy, it's you would have doubt of actually trying to defend yourself, because there's so much at stake. You might not win the war. But if you have so many people who identify with you, who stand with you, and are all focused on the same goal, it would also be easier to revolt against your slave master. But one of the objectives of slavery was exactly that, to destroy the unity amongst the enslaved people, because when they are divided, there would never be a possibility of revolting against the slave master, which means the slave master now remains in power. So that's one of the objectives that we need to understand and we need to know about slavery. Another thing that we have to understand, which is another objective of slavery, is that it was able to destroy the ability of the enslaved people to practice their cultural traditions. So with cultural traditions, that the more people practice their cultural traditions, that emphasizes their identity. It makes them also come together, because most traditions, people do them as a community. People do them together. So the more they engage in those cultural traditions, the more they are being one, the more they're being united, the more the group love grows, the more, the group loyalty grows. But then if a slave master decides that I am going to destroy the possibility of the enslaved people from exercising their cultural traditions, if he decides to do that, it means that he's destroying one thing that held the people together, one thing that reminded people of whom they are, one thing that always emphasized what the enslaved people were before they were enslaved. So when the slave master destroys that, it means that he's ensuring that he's getting rid of one significant substance that brings people together. And what it does, that when he strips away their traditions, it means that now they're also left with a void, because of a lack of identity that was stolen from them by the slave master. So when he gets rid of their traditions, he basically makes them disconnect from whom they really are. And as soon as somebody loses their own sense of identity, they become a slave to the possibility of identifying with something that is not theirs. And I feel like part of human nature is to always want to identify with something. And if you find yourself in an environment where you have no idea, or you've been made to forget who you are, your traditions and your ethics have been taken away from you, you might want to identify with something possible that you find in the environment where you are, So that's why you find that one of the reasons of getting rid of the cultural traditions and all that is because the slave master had a goal to instill his own forms of beliefs and ethics and principles into the enslaved people, so that they become exactly what he wants them to be. So that's another thing that we need to understand. Another thing that we have to know, which is another objective, is that slavery focused on maintaining and manipulating resources. Why is this the case? If somebody controls resources, he basically controls people, because they need resources as well. And if they have no control, they are the slave master's subjects. They are the slave master's objects, because when he makes the calls, they have to follow so that they get access to those resources. So one of the objectives of slavery was to also have control on resources, because the slave master knows that if those that are being enslaved had access to resources, they would actually be able to build the materials they need for revolting. They would actually be able to sustain themselves, to come together, so that they turn against the motion of slavery, and they turn against the slave masters. But he made sure that he controls the resources, so that the enslaved people remain under his control, under his abuse, and under his exploitation. So that's another objective of slavery. Another thing that the slave master makes sure that he does is to segregate. When you divide people from each other, you weaken them. As I've mentioned before, you weaken them. So some of the consequences of slavery, we even see them today in this generation that we have. For instance, due to slavery, Africans were made to detach from their own identity, because their identity was destroyed. They were made to forget about it. They were forced to stay away from their cultural practices. So because of that, they actually had to adopt ethics of the slave master, principles of the slave master, the lifestyles of the slave master, because once they were made to disconnect from their own identity, they ended up accepting the identity of the slave master as the right one. Today you find Africans who believe that speaking with a European accent is better than speaking with an African accent. Most people have this perception that the African accent signifies that you are not smart, that you're not wise, that you're stupid, that you're still barbaric. Most you find that there are African parents who encourage their own children to speak in English because there's this belief that the more the child speaks English, it's a proof that they are smart, they are civilized, they are not barbaric. Because we as Africans, over the past years, we have been convinced that speaking in our own native languages, it seems barbaric and it's backwards. So there are people who keep perpetuating that lie. There are black people who keep perpetuating that lie by encouraging their children to only speak English. You understand that? And another thing that you see is that, look at the beauty, when it comes to beauty generally. Africans believe that being dark-skinned, there are African people who believe that being dark-skinned is ugly to such an extent where they go to bleach their own skin so that they become lighter. You see, it just shows that Africans are disconnected from their own identity, that they end up identifying with the slave master. So they end up associating themselves with an identity that is not theirs, but an identity that is in close proximity to that of the slave master. So when they are convinced that being dark-skinned is being ugly, now what do? They want to be lighter. They want to be light-skinned. Why do they want to be light-skinned? Because they've been taught and they've been encouraged that light is beautiful, that the only thing that is beautiful is what's white. So when they realize that they're dark-skinned, they want to bleach their own skin to look different. You find that for instance, there are Africans who might have coarse hair and they believe that's ugly, and then they decide to opt for fine, smooth hair or things that are along those lines, because they've been convinced that having an afro is not professional, having an afro is not decent, it's not clean. So they do whatever it takes to make sure that they stay away from any natural form of how an African generally looks. So many things that are of African identity, now they are deemed as being barbaric and backwards, because once your identity is bastardized and once you're disconnected from your own true identity, you are prone and subjected to, upholding an identity that was never yours, an identity that is being given to you by, your slave master, by those who are in control, by those who are oppressing you. The oppressed always becomes one who identifies with something that is being provided by the oppressor. That's another thing that actually happens. So those things are actually, there are signs of slavery that are still being seen and they still manifest even today. And that's why I always say that it's significant. It's very much important to have an understanding of our history, because they give us an idea of why exactly are we where we are, and why exactly do we behave the way we do, and what do we do for us to have a better future. You understand that? What do we do to have a better future? So the best thing to go against a problem or to solve a certain problem is to do exactly the opposite of what the problem is all about. Since I've mentioned the objectives of slavery and I've highlighted what exactly slavery aimed to do, it means that now we should have an understanding that, okay, it aimed at pushing us as far away as possible from who we really were. So the best thing to actually stand strong so that history does not repeat itself again is to do exactly the opposite of what those objectives were saying. If what are the objectives of slavery said that we are going to destroy the cultures and traditions of African people, we should be the ones to actually go back to our roots and say, let us embrace our cultures. For instance, if we talk about religious belief systems, if there are African people who find themselves today being subsumed in religions that were never theirs to begin with, we need to actually come together and say, let us step back and look at Africa. What religious beliefs did we have before we became subsumed in beliefs that were not ours? What is it that African people used to believe in? Those are the things that we have to question today and go back to them, because that's really who we were. That's really who we are. And then when it comes to beauty standards, let us go back to Africa. What exactly do Africans believe in when it comes to beauty? We embraced our features as African people before we were enslaved and colonized. But because colonization and slavery came and taught us that being dark-skinned is ugly, that Afro hair is ugly, we believe that because of that. But what exactly was happening before that? We embraced our beauty. We embraced our physical features because that's what Africans are. We embraced being dark-skinned. We embraced having afros. These are the things that we embrace, having big noses. We embrace having big lips because it's whom we are. Let us actually go back and say, you know what? I am not going to use the standards of the slave master to define who I am as an African. I am going to use the standards of African people. I'm going to embrace what I have, who I am, because I am an African. So the most important thing to go against the psychological consequences of slavery is to actually go back to our roots as African people. Based on those objectives, what were they aiming to do? To disconnect us from our identity, to destroy our beliefs and cultural practices, to divide us into groups. So we should actually revolt against that because we see those things still happening now. Some people are still only loyal to their tribes, and they don't want to be loyal to other black people. Some people just want to be loyal to their countrymen, and they don't want to be loyal to other black people that are not from the same country as them. They look at other black people from other countries as the enemy. They look at other black people from other tribes as the enemy. Those are the things that we have to be against as black people. We have to realize that that spirit of division is still amongst black people, and it renders us weak. Because if we see that another tribe, another country of black people is going through something, if my loyalty is only to South Africans or to my tribe, it means that I might just sit back and watch another black man suffering because I have decided that, you know what, I'm just going to stick to my tribe and to my country. That is not what should be happening. Africans should be uniting together, and they should be standing together, because that is the only thing that is going to make us powerful. There is so much power in unity amongst a people, and that is something that African people should be focused on. It's important for Africans to go back to their roots and review again and learn again whom exactly Africans are. We've always been a communal people. Slavery does not define us. That is not our history. That is not who Africans are. That is one of the things that actually interfered with our history. Slavery, colonialism, those are the things that interfered with our history. We were bigger than that before we were enslaved. We were bigger than that before we were colonized. But the thing is, so many people only know a history of defeat when it comes to Africa. That's why so many people have no idea about African identity. That's why so many Africans today, you find them everywhere in different religious beliefs that were never African to begin with, in different identities that were never for Africa to begin with. So many Africans have forgotten their identity and origin. They have no idea who they are, and because of that, they end up identifying with the identities that are given to them by the slave master. But that's something that we have to change. There is still hope. If we stand together as Africans, I believe that we can do a lot. So that is all for this episode. We just covered the objectives of slavery, and we try to connect it to, you know, what's present today. I'm gonna see you next time. I hope that you enjoyed the show. I hope that you enjoyed the episode. And yeah, let's meet again next time with more African history. I'm not only going to cover African history as I've mentioned on the introductory, no, I haven't mentioned it on the introductory video, but generally, I'm not only going to cover African history, I'm going to cover a whole lot of stuff from African history, socioeconomic issues, life issues, etc., etc. But I hope you guys join me, and I hope we have these conversations, because these are significant conversations that have to be had for the betterment of our lives and for the preparations of our futures. Thank you. See you next time. AG, I'm out.